I never imagined I'd become a stranger in the very home I poured my heart into building. But that afternoon, when I walked into the living room and saw my in-laws' suitcases neatly parked beside the west-facing window, the one where I used to read to my grandson during his naps, I realized something in my life had shifted irrevocably. "Did you seriously think you could just move your parents in without even talking to me, Thomas?" I asked, my voice trembling, not from fear but from a rising tide of disbelief and betrayal. My husband, the man I had spent nearly 20 years with, didn't even look up from the laptop he constantly used as a barrier between us. "Don't be dramatic," he said flatly. "It's only temporary." They had nowhere else to go. And besides, this is our house, isn't it? But it wasn't ours. This old Victorian home nestled in the quiet hills of Vermont had been in my family for generations. It was where I had grown up with my grandmother, where we baked apple pies each fall and watched the golden leaves drift past the kitchen window. When she passed, I had used nearly every penny I had to restore the place, not to entertain unwanted guests, but to raise our son, David, in a home filled with warmth and memory. And now every bit of that comfort was being peeled away, inch by inch, not just by luggage, blankets, and footsteps that echoed with disapproval, but by a creeping sense of erasure. A sense that I was no longer the woman this life belonged to. Thomas knew his parents had never accepted me, from the cold glances at our wedding to the way they whispered outsider when they thought I couldn't hear. And yet, he brought them here without a word of warning. Not a conversation, not a compromise. It wasn't just careless, it was betrayal. I could feel myself slipping away, my voice, my space, my worth, like I was fading from my own story while everyone else filled in the pages. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Thomas's silence lingered in the room long after his careless words had faded, but what truly unsettled me wasn't his refusal to discuss it. It was the unshakable ease with which he dismissed me, as if I had no voice, no stake, no meaning in the very place I called home. That night, while I put David to bed, brushing his fine blonde hair back from his forehead as he curled into my arms with his favorite blanket, I tried to ignore the sound of voices drifting from downstairs. Lorna and Gerald, my in-laws, laughing as they unpacked and settled into the guest room like they belonged. Their laughter didn't echo with warmth or gratitude. It rang out like a declaration that this house was no longer mine alone. In the following days, the quiet tension hardened into something more suffocating. It began subtly, Lorna rearranging the spice rack without asking, insisting the coffee maker belonged on her side of the counter, correcting the way I folded the towels with a forced smile that barely hid her contempt. "This isn't the way I keep a home," she remarked casually one morning, shaking her head at my linen closet like it was a shameful secret. I swallowed my pride and said nothing, but inside something began to crack. By the end of the week, she had taken over the kitchen completely. My grandmother's Dutch oven, once used for stews that comforted 3 generations, had been shoved to the back of the cupboard, replaced by Lorna's shiny new set, which she brought without asking, claiming her recipes required real cookware. She stood in my kitchen like a queen in exile, ruling with quiet superiority. And every time I tried to speak up, Thomas would wave it off with that same dismissive tone, telling me I was being overly sensitive, that his parents meant well, and that I should just let it go, for the sake of peace. But there was no peace. Not in the living room, where Gerald hogged the recliner I'd bought for Thomas's birthday and turned the volume up loud enough to rattle the window panes. Not in the hallway, where Lorna criticized the photos on the wall for being too centered on my side of the family, and certainly not at the dinner table, where every meal felt like a quiet war. My parenting questioned, my cooking critiqued, my opinions silenced. One afternoon I found Lorna standing in David's bedroom, her hands rifling through his drawers as if she were inspecting a hotel suite. "This room is a mess," she said. not even glancing at me as I stood frozen at the doorway. Children thrive on order, you know. I'm surprised you haven't figured that out. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice to remain calm even as my heart pounded. Please don't go through his things without asking. She turned slowly, her smile brittle. I'm just trying to help, dear. Clearly someone has to. That night, I lay in bed beside Thomas, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind scratching against the old wooden frame. I wanted to believe this was temporary, that eventually Thomas would come to his senses and realize how far things had gone, but the truth settled over me like dust on an unused shelf. He had already made his choice. And it wasn't me. The final straw came one evening after dinner. I had spent the day taking David to the pediatrician, doing groceries, and managing a dozen tasks around the house, all while trying to keep the peace. I was exhausted. My patience thinned to the thread. As I fed David his dinner, Lorna entered the kitchen, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. Is that what you're feeding him? All that sugar? She asked, peering into his bowl as though I'd poisoned it. It's homemade oatmeal with bananas, I replied, keeping my voice steady. She clicked her tongue in disapproval. No wonder he has trouble sleeping. You coddle him too much. Maybe if you had a proper job, you'd understand what real structure looks like. Thomas said nothing. He just sat there, scrolling on his phone, his face dimly lit by the screen, refusing to meet my eyes. And in that moment, I felt something inside me go still. Not broken, not shattered, just finished. I stood, gently lifting David from his high chair. I'm taking him upstairs, I said quietly. When I reached his room, I rocked him to sleep, humming the lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, and as his little hand clung to my sleeve, I made a decision, not out of anger, but from a deep place of preservation. I couldn't live like this. I wouldn't let my son grow up watching his mother be diminished day after day, made small by people who had no right to occupy her space. And I wouldn't keep clinging to a marriage where my voice had become an inconvenience. But I also knew that before I could reclaim my home, I needed to reclaim my strength. And that meant preparing. Not reacting in anger, but rising with intention. What none of them realized was that the silence they mistook for weakness was, in truth, the calm before a storm they would never see coming. The days that followed blurred into a haze of silent breakfasts, passive glances, and quiet tension thick enough to choke on. Lorna continued to treat the house like her domain, correcting David's posture at the dinner table and replacing the curtains in the guest room without asking. While Gerald paced around like a disapproving supervisor in someone else's factory, scrutinizing every corner of my home as if it had failed some unspoken test. What hurt most wasn't their behavior. It was Thomas's apathy. I kept hoping he would notice how uncomfortable I was, how exhausted I had become, how my smiles had faded into forced pleasantries, but instead he buried himself in work, in silence, in avoidance. He left me to fend for myself in a war I never started, yet one I was forced to fight in my own living room. One morning, I walked into the hallway and found Lorna once again in David's room. Her back turned as she rifled through his dresser drawers, muttering to herself about proper order and how mothers these days just don't have a clue. I stood there for a long second, trying to find the words, trying to steady the anger rising in my chest. But all I could say was, "Please stop going through my son's things." She turned to face me slowly, her expression lined with condescension rather than guilt. "This is our family, dear. You don't get to dictate everything just because your name's on a piece of paper." I clenched my jaw, barely managing to reply, "You're a guest here. Act like one." She laughed, a sharp, joyless sound, and said with a twisted grin, "You poor thing. Thomas never told me you were this delusional. This is his home too, and we're not going anywhere." I don't remember walking away. I only remember ending up in the garage, sitting on the cool concrete floor with my back against the washing machine, trying to breathe through the pounding in my chest. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through my contacts, pausing at one familiar name, Michael, my older brother. He had always been my rock, the one person who could read my voice before I even spoke. I called him, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. When he answered, I couldn't hold it in. "They've taken over my life, Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't breathe in my own house. I feel like I don't exist anymore." He didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurances. He waited. He let me cry. Then he said calmly and with more strength than I had felt in weeks, "Jenna, you have to stop letting them bury you. You own that home. You're David's mother. You're not helpless unless you choose to be." His words didn't heal me instantly, but they lit a fuse. Small, flickering, but undeniable. I had been standing still, paralyzed by politeness, drowning in the belief that sacrifice equaled strength. But sacrifice without respect is just self-erasure. I realized then that the longer I stayed quiet, the more of myself I would lose, until I became someone David didn't recognize. So I stopped waiting for the moment to be right and started preparing for the moment I would make it right. I didn't lash out or throw ultimatums. Not yet. Instead, I sat down with a notepad and wrote. Every insult Lorna had thrown my way, every time she touched my son's belongings without permission, every undermining comment about my parenting, every passive-aggressive glance that made my skin crawl. I wrote it all down. Not to prove it to anyone else, but to remind myself that this was real, that I wasn't imagining the erosion happening under my own roof. Each entry in that notebook was a wound named, and naming them gave me back my power. I began documenting their presence, quietly noting how long they stayed, what they said, how Thomas responded, or didn't. I saved text messages. I started looking up attorneys discreetly, reviewing custody laws and asset rights in Vermont. It was like laying bricks in a wall that would eventually hold me up. I knew this wasn't a battle I could win with kindness. And it certainly wasn't one I could fight through passive endurance. I had to be deliberate. I had to be smarter than the people trying to push me out of my own life. At night, I'd lie awake, David asleep beside me, his tiny breaths soft against my shoulder, and I would imagine what freedom might look like, how the walls would feel if the air inside them no longer carried judgment, how laughter might sound again in a house that was once filled with it. I didn't know how long it would take or how much it would cost me emotionally, but I knew with absolute certainty. I couldn't keep living in a home where my son's safety and my dignity were negotiable. They thought I was soft. They mistook silence for surrender. But in reality, I was watching, listening, calculating. And in that stillness, I was building something far more powerful than anger. I was building resolve. I knew I couldn't just explode and expect things to change. If there's one thing life had taught me by now, it was that reacting from rage might feel satisfying in the moment, but strategy, quiet, careful, deliberate, was what truly shifted the ground beneath people's feet. So instead of screaming, I started preparing. Every morning after packing David's lunch and sending him off to preschool with his tiny backpack bouncing behind him, I would take my second cup of coffee and sit at the kitchen table, my notebook open, a pen in hand, the house still heavy with the scent of lavender and resentment. The pages filled quickly, not just with facts and dates and moments of disrespect, but with my thoughts, my fears, and my growing determination. I wrote about how Lorna criticized my parenting in front of David, how Gerald adjusted the thermostat without asking, and how Thomas, day after day, chose silence over standing by me. I researched quietly, bookmarking pages about property laws in Vermont and the specifics of shared marital assets. Though the house had been mine before the marriage, I wanted to be sure, airtight sure, that no one could claim what they had no right to. I reached out to a family lawyer in Montpellier, someone a friend had quietly recommended, and we spoke in hushed tones during my afternoon walks around the neighborhood, where no one could overhear me planning the future they thought I'd given up on. The more I learned, the calmer I became. There was a strange comfort in understanding the rules of the battlefield, even if I hadn't chosen the war. I learned how to document behaviors without causing suspicion, how to legally separate personal property from shared space, and how to protect David's routines without triggering open conflict. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I was trying to survive, to rebuild, to take back what had been slowly stripped from me. Thomas, meanwhile, remained distant, his presence in the house like a shadow that never quite touched the floor. He left earlier each morning and returned later each night, claiming work had ramped up, though I knew deep down he simply didn't want to witness the tension growing like vines across every corner of our home. In many ways, his absence made it easier for me to plan, to breathe, to reclaim the quiet strength I had let go of somewhere between compromise and self-erasure. There were moments, brief but piercing, when doubt crept in, whispering questions I didn't want to hear. What if I was wrong? What if leaving meant losing more than I could handle? But those moments faded quickly whenever I looked at David's face, saw the innocence in his eyes, and remembered that my silence didn't just cost me peace. It was teaching him that being diminished was acceptable, and that was something I would never allow. In the evenings, while Lorna watched her crime dramas too loudly and Gerald fell asleep snoring in the recliner, I quietly rearranged what was mine. I gathered my grandmother's heirlooms from the dining hutch and wrapped them in linen, stored important documents in a locked box beneath the stairs, and moved my personal files onto a flash drive I kept in my purse. I changed the passwords on my bank accounts, opened a separate one in my maiden name, and rerouted the coffee shop's small quarterly dividend directly to it. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a series of small decisions that added up to something irreversible. But no matter how methodical I tried to be, I couldn't shake the growing distance in Thomas's eyes. He didn't ask where I'd been, didn't notice the files disappearing from the study, didn't even blink when I stopped making him dinner. It was as if he'd already left, emotionally, spiritually, and his body was just lingering out of habit. One night, after David had fallen asleep beside me on the couch, I overheard Thomas in the den, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. The call ended quickly when I walked in, and when I asked who it was, he simply said, "Work," without meeting my gaze. But something in me shifted. The silence between us wasn't just awkward, it was hollow, echoing, like the aftermath of something already broken. And I began to suspect that whatever had kept us together all these years had long since cracked, and now he was simply pretending not to notice. Still, I didn't confront him, not yet. I needed to be sure. So one evening, while cleaning up after dinner, I noticed his laptop left open on the kitchen island. I hesitated, conscious of the boundaries I'd always respected, but that hesitation lasted only a moment. Because respect, I had come to learn, should never be one-sided. The truth was sitting right there in plain view. Dozens of emails, messages from another woman, dates, hotel confirmations, even a photograph. The affair wasn't a fleeting lapse in judgment. It had been ongoing for months, layered in lies and betrayal. My knees went weak, and for a moment I had to grip the counter just to steady myself. I didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, I closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs without a word. In the darkness of my bedroom, I held David close and stared at the ceiling, letting the reality sink in. Not just of his infidelity, but of the life I had fought to preserve for so long, only to realize it was already gone. But I wasn't destroyed. If anything, I felt something anchor deep inside me. A clarity that no one, no matter how familiar, had the right to fracture my spirit. I knew then, with unshakable certainty, that I wasn't going to ask him to explain or apologize or stay. I was going to take back everything I had built, my home, my son's peace, and the life that still belonged to me. The storm was gathering, and this time, it would be mine. I spent the next several days moving with deliberate calm, though every breath I took felt like it carried the weight of an impending storm. On the surface, I went about my routines, packing lunches, returning emails from the cafe I'd inherited from my grandmother, tending to the garden that Lorna had once suggested looked too wild to be respectable. But beneath that stillness, something unshakable had awakened in me. My hands didn't tremble anymore. My voice no longer wavered when I spoke. And each time I passed Thomas in the hallway, I looked him in the eye without flinching, though he barely registered me with more than a nod or an absent-minded grunt. I waited until the weekend. By then I had reviewed everything with my attorney, documented more than enough, and spoken to Michael again, who had offered to be there if I needed him. But I knew this was something I had to face alone, not because I didn't want help, but because I needed to reclaim my voice without anyone speaking for me. That Saturday afternoon, the house smelled of lemon polish and tension. The sun filtered through the blinds in soft streaks, casting lines of light across the hardwood floor where David had once laid out his toy trains. Thomas and his parents were gathered in the living room, sipping coffee and chatting as if nothing had unraveled, as if this house hadn't become a battlefield built on my silence. Lorna was mid-sentence, her voice laced with that familiar condescension, when I walked in and stood across from them, calm and steady, like someone who no longer feared the noise they made. "We need to talk," I said, my tone even, without anger but with a finality that made Gerald lower his mug and glance at me with narrowed eyes. Thomas looked up, surprised by my interruption, but said nothing. "I've tolerated more than I ever should have," I continued, letting my gaze sweep from Lorna to Thomas without blinking. "This house was my inheritance. My name is on every legal paper that built its foundation. And yet for months, I've been treated like a stranger in my own home, dismissed, disrespected, and pushed aside as if I were some inconvenient tenant." Lorna snorted and crossed her arms, already preparing her rebuttal, but I didn't give her the space. "This ends today," I said, louder this time, my voice filling the room without needing to rise into a shout. "I'm done playing hostess to people who've made it clear they never saw me as family. You've crossed boundaries that were never yours to touch, and I will not allow it any longer." "We're just trying to help," Lorna scoffed, but her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "No," I said sharply. "You're trying to control, and I see it for exactly what it is. And Thomas." I turned to him now, not with accusation but with clarity. "You stood by and let it happen. You abandoned me in every way that mattered, and then you betrayed me in the one way I couldn't forgive." His face paled. "What are you talking about?" "The affair," I replied, calm as ever. "I know everything. I read the emails. I saw the dates. I know her name." For a moment he just stared at me, his expression flickering between denial and panic before settling into something hollow. "It's not what you think," he said weakly. "It never is," I replied, "but what it is no longer matters. What matters is that I won't be your excuse, your backup plan, or your doormat anymore. Either they leave, or David and I do, and we don't come back." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Gerald shifted uncomfortably. Lorna opened her mouth but then closed it again. And Thomas simply looked away, defeated. "You wouldn't dare," Lorna said at last, her voice shaking despite her bravado. I met her gaze squarely. "Watch me." That evening they packed their things. Lorna muttered curses under her breath, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and worse. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Her bitterness was just noise now, irrelevant in the face of my decision. Gerald didn't say a word. He simply carried the bags and avoided my eyes. As they stepped out the front door, Lorna turned one last time, her voice sharp and brittle. "You'll regret this, Jenna. You'll be alone." But I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I had already learned that being surrounded by people who devalued you was a lonelier place than any empty room could ever be. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks. The air in the house shifted, not just because it was quieter, but because it was mine again. I could hear David's soft laughter coming from upstairs as he played with his blocks, and for the first time in months, the sound didn't feel out of place in these walls. Thomas, however, remained silent. He lingered like a shadow for the next 2 days, avoiding eye contact, barely speaking beyond polite necessities. And then, on the third morning, he approached me in the kitchen as I was folding laundry at the island and said, "I've got a business trip coming up. I'll be gone for a few weeks." His tone was flat, emotionless, and I didn't bother pretending to be surprised. "Fine," I said without looking up. He nodded once, then walked away, taking nothing more than a suitcase and the tension that had clung to him like smoke. And as the door shut behind him, I realized that it wasn't just the guests who had finally left. It was the weight of trying to hold together something that had long since fallen apart. What he didn't know was that while he was away, everything would change, not out of revenge, but out of rebirth. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was taking my life back, one decision at a time. After Thomas left for his so-called business trip, the house breathed easier. The silence was no longer heavy with avoidance, but instead gently filled the space like sunlight through the windows, quiet, unassuming, and healing. I moved through the days with purpose, no longer just existing but reclaiming. I contacted the lawyer once more, this time not to ask questions, but to act. I explained everything: the infidelity, the emotional neglect, the intrusion of his family, and the gradual erasure of my presence in my own home. With every word I spoke, I felt less like a victim and more like a woman writing the terms of her own justice. We began filing the paperwork: divorce, custody, property protection, and as each document was signed, I felt one brick after another settle beneath my feet, forming the foundation of the life I would rebuild. Next came the real estate agent. I told her I wanted the house sold, quietly, quickly, and for the right price. She hesitated at first, noting how long I'd lived here, how deeply rooted my memories seemed to be in the walls, but I shook my head with steady certainty. "This place used to be my sanctuary," I told her, "but now it's just a shell of what I once loved. I need a fresh start, for me and for David." Viewings were arranged within days. Offers began to come in just as swiftly. I selected a buyer not for the price they offered, but for how respectfully they spoke about the garden, how they admired the stained glass windows in the entryway, pieces of the home that still meant something to me. And with the sale pending, I finalized the separation of finances, secured David's enrollment in a new school, and transferred ownership of the cafe entirely into my name. One by one, I was closing doors behind me, not in anger, but in clarity. When Thomas returned 3 weeks later, the shift was immediate. He walked through the front door as if nothing had changed, dropping his suitcase by the stairs and calling out my name like he still expected me to be waiting in the kitchen with coffee and dinner and forgiveness. But when I stepped into the hallway, he froze. The walls had been stripped of their shared photos, the furniture rearranged, the energy unmistakably different. I met his confused expression with the calm of someone who had already said goodbye. "I sold the house," I said, my voice steady. "It's no longer ours." He blinked, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "You can't just sell it without me." "I didn't," I replied. "It was never yours to begin with." His confusion curdled into anger, but before he could erupt, I handed him a folder. Inside were the divorce papers, financial disclosures, and a signed custody agreement that left no room for interpretation. "What is this?" he asked, though the shaking in his hands told me he already knew. "I'm filing for divorce. I've already consulted legal counsel. David will remain with me. I've done this the right way, the clean way. There's nothing left for us here. Thomas." His voice cracked as he tried to explain, to backpedal, to shift the blame onto his parents, his job, even me. He said I had changed, that I had become distant, but I didn't entertain his revisionist story. I simply told him I didn't change, I just stopped shrinking. He left in silence that evening, dragging his suitcase behind him like a man leaving a life he thought he controlled. And not long after, the consequences began to echo beyond our home. Word of the affair spread through our small Vermont community, not from me, but through the natural unraveling of secrets that never stay buried. His co-workers began to distance themselves. The few friends he still had grew cold. And as for Lorna and Gerald, their social circles, once tight-knit and full of judgment, slowly turned away from them. Those who once praised their discipline and family values now looked at them with a mixture of pity and disdain. The very people who once whispered behind my back now avoided eye contact with them at the farmer's market and skipped their invitations to neighborhood brunches. Lorna tried reaching out, sending a stiff apology email riddled with excuses and veiled resentment. She wanted to see David, she said, claiming it was unfair to be kept at a distance from her grandson. But I didn't respond. I had no interest in reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. Gerald didn't write at all, and I suspected even he had finally realized the line between loyalty and complicity. The day of the final hearing arrived on a rainy Thursday, the sky grey and heavy as if mourning the ending of a chapter that had long outlived its worth. In court, Thomas looked diminished, his usual confidence hollowed out, his voice barely audible as he spoke. He didn't contest the terms. Perhaps he knew there was nothing left to fight for. When the judge signed the decree and granted me full custody of David, I didn't smile or cry. I simply exhaled, a quiet release of years' worth of weight. Afterward, he approached me outside the courthouse, his eyes red and desperate. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing left to say," I replied. "But I've lost everything," he said, trembling. "My job, my reputation, even my parents are struggling. I'm ruined." I looked at him, not with cruelty, but with the kind of detached empathy that comes when you've made peace with the past. "That's not my burden to carry anymore," I said. "We all live with the consequences of our choices." As I walked away, David's small hand nestled in mine. I felt a kind of peace that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with liberation. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of something unshakably mine. Life after the storm didn't come with trumpets or some grand cinematic victory. It came quietly, with the morning light streaming in through windows that no longer echoed with tension, and with the sound of David's laughter returning like a melody I hadn't realized I'd missed so deeply. The house, now sold, was behind us, and with it, all the ghosts of a life that once demanded I shrink just to fit within its walls. We moved into a smaller cottage nestled near the edge of a peaceful town in upstate New York, not far from the lakes my father used to fish when I was a child. The garden out front wasn't much, but it bloomed in soft colours by mid-May, and the porch creaked under our footsteps in a way that felt less like decay and more like welcome. It wasn't grandeur I was after. It was peace, and piece by piece I was finding it. The cafe, once a modest family business, became my second sanctuary. I took over its operations fully, breathed life into its old charm, and transformed it into a space not just for coffee, but for comfort, for conversations, for second chances, for people like me who knew what it was to rebuild from splinters. I repainted the walls, added warm lights above the tables, and brought back the walnut counter my grandmother had once polished with lemon oil every Sunday morning. Locals noticed the change. Some returned out of curiosity, others out of support, and more than a few came just to sit quietly, as if the walls themselves offered something they couldn't name. And I did heal, not all at once, not completely, but slowly, with each small routine. Morning walks with David to school, evenings spent reading by the fireplace, quiet Sundays at the lake. There were moments when the past tried to return, as it always does, faint shadows that flickered across my thoughts when I least expected, but they didn't stay long, because the woman who used to flinch at confrontation was no longer the one living in my skin. Thomas reached out once more weeks after the court's final decision. He came to the cafe just before closing, looking worn and unfamiliar, like someone who had finally been forced to sit with himself. He asked about David, about how I was holding up, about whether I could ever consider forgiveness, not to repair the past, but to unburden the present. I told him forgiveness wasn't a door he could knock on. It was a bridge I had chosen to build, brick by brick on my own terms, without expecting him to walk across it. He nodded, unsure whether to be grateful or ashamed, then left without asking for anything else. That was the last I saw of him. As for Lorna and Gerald, their names eventually faded into the distance, mentioned only in passing by neighbours who once held them in high regard, but now spoke of them with muted regret. They had gambled their pride against the wrong woman's silence, and lost. The greatest surprise of all, though, wasn't the peace I found in solitude, or the comfort I drew from routine, but the strength I discovered in simply surviving, and then choosing day after day to live again. I didn't need to reinvent myself with dramatic flair or public declarations. I just needed to come home to myself and stay. One evening, as David and I walked back from the lake, the sky painted with streaks of gold and violet, he looked up at me with eyes too wise for his years and said, "Mom, are we happy now?" I paused, feeling the weight and the beauty of that question settle deep in my chest. "We are," I said, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, "and we're safe. That matters more." We walked the rest of the way hand in hand, his small fingers curled around mine like a promise to never go back, only forward. And as we stepped into our little cottage, the scent of warm bread drifting from the kitchen and the soft sound of a record playing in the background, I knew that I had not just escaped a life that nearly swallowed me whole. I had built one that finally fit. If this story resonated with you, or reminded you of a time you had to stand up for yourself, I want you to know this. Your strength is not measured by how loudly you fight, but by how quietly you refuse to be broken. Share this story with someone who needs that reminder today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of healing, justice, and quiet courage.